Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along and also giving me the opportunity to say a few words, and I'll try and keep it sort of short. I'm conscious this is a fairly massive topic, and it's slightly sobering to think that it's 7 years since we published the Ecosystems Task Force report, and I think we've got one thing done so far. So this is a long and sort of somewhat challenging process, but one I think which is absolutely essential. So I'm really pleased to see this pieces of work and potentially the next phase. I just want to make sort of 4 points from a business, and I suppose now I'm an imposter banker as well, so business and finance perspective. The first is that business and finance actually does want to value nature. It wants to make better decisions. It needs help doing it, particularly when we come on to talk about the toolkit and maybe the measures and the sort of demos that we can do. But fundamentally, I think we now understand in the business and finance world that there is that level of responsibility, not just for our externalities that we directly touch on, but a broader sense of responsibility that business has to play in the transition that Duncan talked about, and a sense that it is no longer someone else's job. There's still an enormous amount of confusion and uncertainty about how to make the next step. But if I contrast it to maybe 10, 15 years ago, certainly when I was running Kingfisher, talking to people about the role that business could play, I got a lot of blank looks from various chief execs saying, but that's nothing to do with me. I think the businesses now understand it, partly because of the cohort coming through, but also because of the, frankly, the emergency that is now perceived around climate and biodiversity has really been, I think, recognised in a way that wasn't true 10, 15 years ago. So I think on a positive note, business is very interested to understand how it could value nature better, how it can make the right long-term decisions and come up with a sustainable set of business models. To do that, it really does need some help from science-based, evidence-based frameworks. If you think that the business world has had over 500 years of practice at double-entry bookkeeping accounting, and it's got about 5 minutes experience of natural capital and thinking about assets in a different way. This is something that is still in very early days. And a lot of people, again, Duncan's comment, I had exactly the same issue when we started the Ecosystems Task Force, was how on earth do you measure one of these? You know, I can talk about a ton of carbon, but what's a ton of biodiversity? I don't understand how we do any of that. So I think we are now equipping ourselves more and more with the tools and the understanding and the measurement systems, but these are really not, if you like, well-practiced skills. And so having a solid research underpinning and particularly helping people demonstrate with tests and pilots and how you scale some of those pilots is a really massive contribution. And business can't really do that on its own. We're very keen to come to the party, but we need, I think, quite a lot more help. And to my mind, one of my takeaways is that I learned a colossal amount from the rest of the team, including people like Ian Bateman, who was also part of it. When they started to put some sort of measurement and toolkit around it, I found that a lot easier to talk about how, for example, the value of a forest goes up if it's near an urban centre, which makes sense because of the access benefits, and there is such a thing as being able to have too many trees if you put them in the wrong place. So I think the sort of toolkit, the science, the evidence is a really fundamental part. And business needs help and sort of probably, frankly, being very basic about it, Duncan, research funding to help teams like guys make those sort of advances. I think the third thing we'd like to see from a business point of view is a coordination amongst the various parties so we don't reinvent the wheel the whole time. There are lots of great bits of work going on in various different places. A sense that if we could have a coordinated approach to this agenda and a thoughtful approach to where research and innovation is happening on which topics. And obviously there's a natural desire for all sorts of institutions to put their best foot forward. But given how difficult this challenge is, the last thing we really need to do is have people squabbling over the same territory. So if we could have an integrated map of the R&I agenda and say, well, who's doing what, and be willing to sort of allocate, you know, if you're really good in this area, then great, you do that and we'll do this. I think requires, you know, a coming together around this agenda and a generosity maybe perhaps amongst the institutions to focus on where they can add more comparative advantage. I think the fourth and final thing I'll just say briefly now is the other party to make this all happen is the government and various forms of regulation and incentive, and also probably direct government investment. You know, if you're going to build something as big as HS2, you might want to think about how that plays out in terms of sort of natural capital. But I think we will need to see a direct link to the policy agenda. I think the sheer fact we've got an environment bill, the sheer fact that we've got the degree of conversation at these levels, and to my mind, the opportunity, particularly in the farming sector, which we've been looking at through the Food Farming Countryside Commission, to think differently about how subsidies and incentives work, makes this a really critical juncture. And I frequently, I'm afraid, cite the example of how business and regulation can combine for positive effect as being the landfill tax. Once we knew as businesses what the playing field looked like, how that was going to work, we could suddenly look at our waste streams and say, right, what do we do about it? In the same way that, frankly, 5p on a plastic bag has produced a behavior shift in consumers. So we can, as a business community and a finance community, work with regulation. It's not an anti-regulation piece, but it has to be effective, smart regulation, and above all, a level playing field. So the final example I would use is I'm currently chairing a small task force on Britain's global footprint, GRI task force, and one of the things we want to do is try and set up Britain legally to stop importing deforestation. Now, to do that, one of the things we have to do is have clarity on due diligence of where product is coming from. And if we do that as an industry, the costs are shared, the playing field is level, and frankly, the cost won't be that great. And I think those sorts of smallish but quite clear interventions are going to be needed in lots of different areas. And I think the challenge for us when we think about this as a broader business and finance community is a massive, massive waterfront we're trying to cover. And I think rather than try and be defeated by that, we have to start making progress in a number of quite specific areas. So stopping importing deforestation strikes me as a pretty incontrovertible thing. Why wouldn't we want to do that? But equally, there are lots of things to do with decarbonising our energy system, switching the transport system. There is a long, long list into which we need this, again, this science-based, research-based understanding of how we correctly value nature. And so the final micro example I would leave you with, which came out of our work on the Food and Farming Countryside Commission, was a long-term desire to find a way, and this is also very relevant for Barclays as we bank 25% of the country's farmers, of tying the subsidies we give to farmers to a natural capital balance sheet at a farm level. Now, one of the challenges there is no one's got any measurement around that. No one knows how to do it at the moment. Conceptually, it sounds really straightforward, and conceptually, it's sort of what lies behind the ELMS schemes. But could we find a piece of research and innovation that would allow us to find farmers a really easy, practical, low-cost way of doing this, ideally with data that is automatically read in from a variety of other places. They don't have to fill in 8 million forms. And could we enable that so that there is a real alignment there between the money that we as public are giving for public goods and actually a natural capital analysis that is practical and useful. And those sorts of, that example is just one of a whole series of other things we can do in other areas. But it has to be underpinned by this willingness of business and finance to do it, a real desire to find the sort of evidence base rather than just sort of stumble in and make things up, a real desire to collaborate, and then finally a real need for the government and regulatory framework to be brought to bear. I'm incredibly optimistic despite the 7-year sort of cycle of getting from one report to one initiative, because we have to keep going. And I'm really pleased to see the work that the team have been doing here today and would thoroughly recommend it. So with that, I will make way for the next keynote. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed.